Thanks for tuning in. Just wanted to take a second to let y'all know I am now an Amazon affiliate. So any shopping you plan on doing through Amazon, visit strangerencounterspodcast.com and go through the affiliate link. If you prefer, you can donate at Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Thomas D. Salmons and you can donate. Hope keep the show up and running. Thanks. Welcome to Stranger Encounters. I am Thomas Salmons. Today's guest is Scott Horton, the #1 voice in foreign policy. And in this episode, we dig into a little of everything. Venezuela, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Russia. You hear a little of everything. So hang on tight. This is a long one, but there's a lot of information packed in. Enjoy. Well, I'm here with Scott Horton. What's going on, Scott?
How you doing, man? Thanks for having me.
Oh, man, thanks for coming on such short notice.
Oh, happy to do it.
Well, I wanted to get with you about some of Trump's foreign policy. And the big thing in the news today, or not today, but lately, is Venezuela. And I kind of keep up with what the talking heads say, and unfortunately, a lot of comedians have become talking heads over the years. And I heard Bill Maher touting the Monroe Doctrine when discussing Venezuela, and I was like, "Oh my God, these
Isn't
guys!"
he sickening, that guy? By the way, I mean, there's part of the Monroe Doctrine says other European powers better stay out of the Americas. I think it's what's his name's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that says, by the way, we can do whatever we want there. But seriously, like, just because, and this was what happens when you have no principles at all, right? It's like, I don't know, Monroe says we can do it, but there's no other reason why not that Mark can think of. But yeah. Terrible.
Yeah, I was just like, what is this? And then I saw a meme the other day, and I don't know if this is backed up by any facts, but I did see a meme the other day that apparently they have discovered American-made weapons being spread through Venezuela here recently. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I did read one report about that, about a plane full, and they said there have been these planes full. I don't know. I mean, it could be propaganda. It could be true. I sure hope not. I mean, so bottom line with Venezuela is it's a really bad government that the majority seems to essentially support, that the wealthier, more right-wing minority would like to see overthrown. There's also seems to be rigged elections. I mean, this guy, when the opposition took control of essentially their House of Representatives, he's created a new one and filled it with all his guys, held a couple of bogus elections and this kind of thing. And yet, I just read this report that was really interesting by a Russian reporter there who was talking about how, and he didn't get into the specifics, but apparently the price controls are no longer in place, or at least, they raised the allowable price to such a situation as to allow commerce there. So he says it is not the case that everybody there is starving or whatever. There's plenty of food on the shelves, and that's in the government stores and in the regular stores too. Mm-hmm. And that there are protests, anti-government and pro-government protests in this city, but that the vast majority of the city, everybody's just going about their day and not participating in that. This is not a situation where everybody is picking a side and ready to fight about it and this and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I heard Abby Martin say something like that.
Yeah, so in other words, it's a complicated mess. It's none of our damn business, right?
Exactly.
And so except that, yeah, it is, and business literally, right? Because American oil companies have deals with the Venezuelans. And my friend Greg Palast, who's energy reporter, in a way, I guess you could say, has talked about how, essentially part of the story is that the Kochs own this refinery in Corpus Christi that's tooled to handle very heavy Venezuelan crude, and it's not, made to do anything else, really. And so Chavez knew that he had the Kochs as a captive market there, and he put the squeeze on them, and he charged them extra. And they hated him for it, but there was nothing really that much that they could do about it. And so Maduro had done the same thing. So that's their interest there. And then he also said that Exxon has a huge interest in taking control. And John Bolton himself said, he didn't name Exxon, but he said, yeah, it would be very good for America's economy, which is ridiculous, right? We're talking about completely marginal when it comes to America's national interest, including, your family and mine. No. But he says it'd be, great for the economy if American companies could own those resources and develop them. And so, in other words, we want that oil and the money too.
Well, it's reminiscent of.
We're willing to.
I was just going to say it's reminiscent of United Fruit, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the deal. Essentially, the idea here is that these people don't have the right to independence, regardless of whatever you think of their government. Seriously, imagine if the standard was that America gets to intervene in any country where you don't like the way the government there does things.
Yeah.
And that's the standard. So that's every country in the whole world forever with no exceptions, right? Even Canada, everyone. It's on.
Right.
That's ridiculous. We got no right.
And wouldn't it be evidentiary that the poll numbers would be unnaturally high in an election if the election was being rigged?
Well, the opposition has boycotted them because I think they have been kind of unfair elections. My understanding is the last couple have been rigged, but also the opposition doesn't have their act together. They got 4 or 5 different parties that can't agree. And, maybe if they all joined together, they would be an effective opposition. But thus far, they've not been. In fact, the Wall Street Journal had a piece about this guy, Juan Guaido, who has declared himself the president now. How it was him and 4 other people who decided that was what they were going to do the day after getting a phone call from Vice President Mike Pence telling him this is the deal. And the rest of the opposition was totally in the dark. And this Wall Street Journal story has interviews with all these other people involved in the opposition who were like, wow, what the hell is going on? We had no idea. And in fact, when he announced, I'm declaring myself president today, some of his allies got up and walked off the stage because they were taken by surprise and they completely disapproved. So they don't have their act together at all, whatever you think of their goals. And they probably do have more sound economics in terms of, hyperinflation and price controls is no way to run an economy, stupid, right? At the same time, though, when the right had control over that country, they were brutal tyrants and froze everyone else out. So, there's a reason that the masses of the people support the socialists there ever since Hugo Chavez and now Maduro. And in fact, in that report by that Russian that I was talking about, he talks about everybody gets a free tank of gas a day. And if you're really poor and you don't have a house, you can live in a government house. You get a free house. And they like it like that. Guess what? And they don't want anybody to change that. Yeah. Their votes are bought. And you're talking about people who are very poor, who they need a house.
Yeah.
And by the way, the oil there was always owned by the government. It's always been nationalized. It just used to be that only the richest people got the welfare money. And what the socialists did was come and distributed it to everybody, much more so. But of course, they also, being socialists, don't understand economics at all, and they completely blew it. They were relying on extremely high oil prices for the long term, and the oil prices crashed considerably, and that hurt them terribly. And so they just started printing money instead of cutting back. And so that was a real problem. But also they got the U.S. Treasury waging an economic war against them, too, and cutting them off from SWIFT. And I'm not sure about the Bank for International Settlements, but putting all these sanctions on them and then now seizing all their oil money. from Citgo and all that. They're taking that money and giving it to the opposition. The Bank of England stole all their gold and said that now they're going to give that to the opposition. And, like I say, it's John Bolton saying, yeah, we want to control the oil there and take all the money and the oil too. Ha ha. How do you like that? And then he hires, the Secretary of State, Pompeo, hires Elliot Abrams, who's, helped lead at least cover-ups of war crimes in El Salvador in the Reagan years and was a huge part of all different follies in the George W. Bush years in terms of Iraq and Palestine as well. And hired him to carry it out. And so it's really, I don't know exactly how to quantify, but it sure looks like it's much more a foreign coup than anything else. This is what happened in Chile in 1973, right? Nixon and Kissinger had this plot that we don't like this guy, this socialist who came in here. So what we're going to do is, he's going to wreck the economy anyway, but we are going to make the economy scream. That was Nixon's words. Make it scream. Destabilize their economy as much as we can to destabilize their government and pave the way for a coup. And then I guess it was like the House of Representatives and the court agreed that they could overthrow the president and put this general in charge instead. That's how America does business over there. And then lots of people get killed. In this case, they plotted this whole game, except they didn't have the military on board. And so their right-wing putsch kind of failed because the military's like, well, Morales is still paying us. How are you going to pay us? And, by the way, and this is on antiwar.com today, and this is so all overt and not clandestine at all. They're saying, yeah, we're talking to the military. We're doing everything we can to negotiate with the military. In other words, to bribe them to change teams here. And they're openly admitting that that's what they're doing. So, yeah, and of course, this has resulted in a boost for the approval ratings for Maduro, who's driving, his government's driving the economy of this country into the ground. And then America, by basically reaffirming the truth of his narrative that this is all a Yankee plot against him, makes him, of course, seem more credible to his people and help solidify his power. So, I hope that it just fizzles out and goes away now, because what are you going to do? If the army won't change sides, then game is up. But then, you know what? Like you're saying, they can dump a bunch of guns into the country. Mm-hmm. They could spend a lot of money and try to create right-wing militias and death squads to go after and start a war here. They could promise $1 billion of money right out of your paycheck to some general to kill another general and take his place, or God knows what, arrest him or whatever. We've seen this movie before over and over again there. So not necessarily exactly in Venezuela, although I don't know. I'm sure there's been American coups in Venezuela before.
Well, there was a coup in Honduras
actually, I know there was one in
2009.
2002, but that doesn't count because it got canceled immediately. But before that, back in history.
Yeah, weren't you talking about a documentary about that one? What was that called?
Yeah, it's called The Revolution Will Be Televised. And it's incredible, man. So you have, I forget if they're French or German or American or what filmmakers, but I guess they're white. But they were leftists. They're filming the Chavez government right when the coup broke out. So they're right there in the presidential palace or whatever it's called exactly. And the coup leaders are all there, and the coup leaders look at them and go, well, you're white and you're wearing a polo shirt or whatever, I guess, so you fit in with us. So you must, I guess you're supposed to be here. And so they didn't stop them. They just kept filming. And so they just documented the entire coup from inside the damn palace. And
that's crazy.
Now I forget if they actually show the troops, or you just come to understand that it wasn't just that millions of people were protesting outside saying, we're about to tear you people limb from limb. Your coup is canceled. But they also had, I forget if Chavez sent the message himself or somehow from the plane, or somehow the message got sent that Chavez knew this was coming and he hid his most loyal paratroopers inside the walls of the presidential palace. You guys are surrounded. You guys are busted, and you're either going to get down on your hands and knees right now, or you're going to die. And it was like, yeah, man, you can watch it. It's on YouTube right now. The revolution will be televised. And it's the whole thing.
I'll link to it in the show
and there
notes.
were millions of people outside. And you know what? There were huge protests. I forget at which time there was where I remember Greg Palast did reporting for BBC Newsnight, where there was this huge anti-Chavez protest outside. It was like, I don't know, 100,000 people or something, a huge protest. And this is what all the international media were showing. And then Greg Palast is like, man, that is impressive. And then he turns the camera 45 degrees or 90 degrees down the other side of the street. And there's millions of people out there protesting for the leftists. And so, you can do a lot with a camera to make something look like something, but it's all in the context. You know what I mean? And I think the reality is here that, like I say, they did have some crooked elections, but the opposition couldn't get their act together either. And overall, essentially, as bad as the government is, and there are, I should mention that like 3 million people have fled the country, something like that, because of how bad the economy is. So in terms of voting with their feet, that's huge. But as bad as all that is, what it really boils down to ultimately is the rich white elite versus the majority, maybe even super majority Indian population of the country. And so, and like I say, it always was socialism just before it was socialism for the rich. And what the socialists did was they came and they made it socialism for everybody. And so it's pretty hard to reverse that. You know what I mean? Once you're giving everybody free gasoline all day long, free place to live and all free of the most important necessities, staples and toilet paper and these kinds of things. You should go read that article. It's at the Vineyard of the Saker. Old friend of mine from a long time ago, actually, the Saker. He has a guest post translated from Russian from this journalist who writes with a sense of humor. He gets robbed by a cop, or he interviews a guy who gets robbed by a cop for his phone. Give me your phone, stick up, and it's a cop that does it. It's a fun little story. In fact, that might be an easy way to Google it. Like Venezuela robbed by a cop for cell phone, something like that. It'll probably come up.
Okay. I'll look it up. I'll put it in the show notes. I was thinking of,
I don't know everything about it. I don't claim to know everything about it, but I know that the U.S. has no right whatsoever to intervene in any other country. Independence first. That's for us and for them too.
Right. And then there was the whole scandal with Bolton having the notepad that had 5,000 troops to Colombia written on it. Do you know what to make of that? Does this have to do with Venezuela, or what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, presumably, but what are 5,000 troops going to do? They're not going to invade the country with 5,000 men. So, I don't know. Yeah, if they had, I guess, yeah, and you know what? That doesn't even, I don't think, properly represent like an assassination team, like a real high level hit squad, like JSOC. Top tier special operations forces. If anything, it sounds more like a deployment of Rangers or something like that, or some Marines or something. I don't know. But like regular infantry. But then 5,000 of them to what end? I don't know. I mean, that's
if they're arming
Bolton says a lot of things. I don't know.
If they're arming the counterinsurgents in Venezuela, and they send 5,000 troops in to assist them in training and fighting. Similar to the 2,000, like we have 2,500 troops in Syria, I mean, it could be a situation like that we're looking at here in the next year or so.
I mean, as insane as it sounds, it could happen. It's just, and can you imagine starting a war where you don't have one?
Yeah.
Starting a war. It could kill hundreds of thousands of people. And America's done this in Latin America over and over and over again. And to think that they could do this right now in Venezuela, I mean, it's horrifying. And you know what? I kind of feel like they're not gonna, like they're gonna have to back down because, man, I don't know. But that's probably the first time you ever catch me being too optimistic, I guess.
They might have to back down just because everything's so out in the open, and they like to do all this stuff in secrecy. They like to do it behind the curtain. But my main thing is the people that are touting for a wall and complaining about immigration to the United States, they're not looking at this as like being causal to more immigration to the United States. And it's like, if you go in there and you start this war, you're going to have refugees fleeing a war zone. You have to, if you want to address immigration, you got to cut the head off the snake, and you can't keep having, the military go in and overthrow regimes, creating more refugees. You're working against your own self-interest.
Hey, look, right now, one of the major crises justifying building the wall and this whole anti-immigration policy is the threat of the street gang, essentially street gang, MS-13, drug cartel gang, who are blowback from Ronald Reagan's intervention in El Salvador in the mid-1980s, early and mid-1980s, where these guys were refugees and the children of refugees who fled El Salvador's violence to come to the United States, lived in L.A., where there they got indoctrinated into all the gang culture of South L.A., right at the era when the Crips and the Bloods were having a full-scale war over who controlled the black market in the CIA's cocaine that they were importing to help clandestinely pay for the war in Nicaragua next door. Mm-hmm. And so then they all got deported by Bill Clinton, and they got sent back to El Salvador. And there they brought, their hardcore gang culture back, and their very harshest leaders took control, and they created a force to be reckoned with down in El Salvador. A horrible gang, the kind of mob that can literally say, we run this town. We own the cops, own the judges, own the mayor. We'll kill you. Serious ass. This level of thing. And then these are the guys who now in the next generation are coming back to the United States and in fact are causing trouble. So like you're saying, we mess around in Venezuela now, then that's the kind of thing where 25 years from now, when I got no hair left at all, we're going to be sitting here going, yep, well, it was just timing back like we talked about back before 2020 even, how this was what was going to happen. We're going to end up with long-term consequences of this intervention where there's just absolutely unnecessary to do.
Right. Yeah, I worked with a guy I used to work in Rosenberg, south of Houston, and I worked with a guy who was from El Salvador, and he fled to the United States to escape MS-13. And so, yeah, it's a bad deal down there.
Blowback.
Yep. And that
means the long-term consequences of secret foreign policies, so that the American people don't understand what's happening, where to assign responsibility. And so MS-13, well, you know how them scary Latin American types are, and nobody points the blame at American government policy, which is always to blame. I mean, hell, if we're talking about why does a bank fail, we start with government regulation and control of and licensing of fraud in banking, right? It's government. And that's when the most responsible, most powerful, richest billionaires in the world screw up their business and drive it into the ground. Before we get to their responsibility, we talk about how Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke gave them a license to print money and make bad loans, but the bad loans caught up with them, right? Because that's why. So why should it be anything less when we're talking about social problems like drugs, when we're talking about immigration, when we're talking about, hell, anything that's wrong? Always start with the government. Why the hell is everything so horrible in the Middle East? Because of the USA, of course. Why should that be hard for anybody to admit that the U.S. government? Hey, Martin Luther King said that the U.S. government is the greatest purveyor of violence on the face of the earth. Yeah. Of course. And so there you go. Martin Luther King said it, so it's true. Ike Eisenhower said that our economy is being corrupted by this combination of interests between the military, the arms industrialists, and the Treasury Department. And that something's got to be done. But by the way, sorry, today's my last day. Good luck, everybody. Bye. And then left. And here we still are. Was there ever a reckoning with that? At some point, who took care of that problem? Right, exactly. They didn't, and that's where we are right now.
Well, and you can look at where the migrant caravans just here recently. You can look at where these caravans are forming nowadays in Honduras And there was a coup in Honduras
and
in
look
2009.
at the refugee crisis in the Middle East. Yeah, literally the refugee crisis in the Middle East, the refugees are from, ready? Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Syria, Iraq. All the countries America's been bombing. Every single one of them. That's where the refugees are from.
Yeah.
And then people go, oh, man, these Arabs, they're invading Europe. Man, they're running for their lives from the Europeans and the Americans in their home countries.
Right. And then you have the talking point of, well, they're all military age men. Well, you know, you're telling me like you're going to sit there and tell me that every single man in the United States that's military age would have the gumption and the wherewithal, the balls, the courage to fight the strongest military in the world? That's what you're telling me? Like, that's bullshit. Of course they're fleeing. They're fleeing for their lives.
Well, it goes to show. Yeah, it goes to show that the populations of these countries are not our enemies at all. They're just trying to get the hell out of the way. It's not like the average Syrian is a member of the Islamic State or anything like that. Right. You know, in fact, well, not to get too far into that, but, you know, all the worst hype about the refugee crisis in – I'm sorry?
I did want to talk about Syria, so we can start moving in that direction.
All right. Well, so all the worst hype about the refugee crisis in Syria was, in terms of public relations, was about this poor dead toddler on the beach whose body had washed up on the beach. And they said, oh, isn't that mean old Assad? But that kid's family was pro-Assad. They were Kurds, and they were fleeing American-backed Al-Qaeda suicide bomber head chopper murderers. That's who they were fleeing. America was supporting essentially the Sunni-based insurgency, the worst part of the Sunni-based insurgency in Iraq War II. They were the so-called good guy moderate rebels in Syria, and they were not any such thing. And that's what led to the rise of the Islamic State. Obama was backing them for 3 years before they became the Islamic State. And 2 years before they really started seizing territory. They called themselves that ever since 2006, actually. But they started actually making a state in 2013 after the CIA had already given them $2 billion, essentially, and all our allies a bunch more money and guns and everything else. And so, you know, you scratch just the surface on any of these media narratives and you get right to things that they seem to not make sense. Like, you might ask me, but Scott Horton, why would America back Al-Qaeda in Syria? And then the answer is, well, because the government in Syria is friends with the government in Iran. And our government hates Iran more than they hate Al-Qaeda. Now, you might think that Al-Qaeda are the enemies of America because they're the ones who knocked the towers down and killed all those civilians, and they're the ones who were the worst part of the Sunni insurgency that killed 4,000 out of 4,500 of our guys in Iraq War II. But our government hates Iran more. And our government hates Iran so much more, and this includes the Obama government. The same Obama government that made a deal with Iran over their nuclear program. In fact, maybe partially because he made a nuclear deal with them, he doubled down on the fight against them in Syria just to prove how loyal to Iran he wasn't. He was just doing this nuclear deal. That's all. Watch, I'll fight him in Syria. And that was what it was. He told Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic, that's right, Jeffrey Goldberg, because it was Goldberg pushing him. But he says, yeah, that's right. If we get rid of Assad in Syria, that's a great way to weaken Iran and to take them down a peg by overthrowing one of their allies. It would have been the last Arab state allied with Iran, but Bush Jr. had given them Baghdad. So now this was the consolation prize. After giving their friends Baghdad, they said, well, at least we can get rid of Assad. And so that was why they were willing to do it. And that was what led to the rise of the Islamic State. Now that the Islamic State is defeated, because it wasn't supposed to, you know, I guess they didn't care if they seized eastern Syria, but they weren't supposed to conquer all of western Iraq. Oops. Yeah. So then they had to launch Iraq War III to overthrow the Islamic State and run them out of western Iraq and eastern Syria. But now that's over. And what do they say? They say we have to stay because Iran. Not because sometimes they invoke left over the last few hundred ISIS guys. Yeah, right. They don't say anything about the real terrorists hiding out in the Idlib province because those are America's former moderates, the Al-Qaeda guys. So we're just going to leave them to the tender mercies of Hezbollah and Russia and the Syrian Arab army. They're too far west to be, part of America's, theater of engagement there. But if you listen to these hawks, in fact, there's this the new McConnell amendment that denounces or resolution or whatever that denounces Trump for seeking to get out of Syria and Afghanistan, and says that, I don't know if it says he can't, but it says he shouldn't or whatever it is. That the Washington Post said this is a severe rebuke to Trump's horrible amateurish foreign policy of wanting to get out of here or whatever. Well, that thing is riddled through with Iran. But Iran didn't knock the towers down. Hezbollah didn't knock the towers down. Assad didn't knock the towers down. It was the other side of the Sunni Shia split, the Persian Arab split over there that did that attack. It was, radical Sunni jihadists like bin Laden and Zawahiri who hated America for being too close of allies to their governments in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. None of those hijackers were from the axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. They were all from countries that were too close of allies to the United States. So then when Bush Jr. fights Iraq War II and ultimately ends up handing full power to the Shiite supermajority allied with Iran, that's considered a massive error and own goal. And so then everything they've done since then has been to try to suck up to the Saudis and the Sunni kings of Arabia and the Israelis, for that matter, who helped lie us into that war. But oops, you don't like Iran being empowered? Okay, we'll do everything we can now to counter Iranian influence everywhere else. We can't start Iraq War II all over again and kill another million people, kicking the Shiites out of Baghdad and giving it to the Sunnis. That can't fly. So we'll just have to focus on attacking Iran here, there, and everywhere. And so, but now the only authorization that Trump has to fight any of these groups is the AUMF of 2001 that says he's authorized to fight the groups that did the 9/11 attack. Well, they're gone. Mm-hmm. Now they've added all these words that aren't even in there. Associated forces and descended groups and all of these things that aren't even in there. But now they want to go ahead and throw in the other side of the war and say that that same authorization to use force somehow applies to the Iranians. And let me tell you something, this is what should really matter, is that if the Americans did do a regime change, either through some CIA coup or assassination or a full-scale Air Force bombing campaign or God knows what, somehow, that there is nothing that would please Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, more than that. But our government, they say all day long, Iran is the greatest sponsor of terror. Yeah. Are they the greatest sponsor of Al-Qaeda? No. That would be Saudi and America are the greatest backers of Al-Qaeda, even after 9/11, even after Iraq War II, and 4,000 died fighting the Sunni-based insurgency, which Al-Qaeda was the worst part of there. And so, yeah, it is. It's treason. It's crazy. And it's not because Obama was loyal to the terrorists because he's a secret Muslim from Kenya. It's because he's Bill Clinton. He's George W. Bush. He's continuing the policy of George W. Bush. George W. Bush, yes, he gave Baghdad to Iran's friends and fought for that government for 5 years on their side of that civil war. But as early as 2006, his government was saying, oops, man, well, we have to finish the job that we started as far as Baghdad goes. We have to complete that, I guess, but we need to start tilting back toward the Sunnis. We need to tell the Saudi king sorry for messing up. And it's in the WikiLeaks, too, where they sent Dick Cheney to apologize to the Saudi king. Even Dick Cheney himself, to that audience, would admit that he screwed it up. And the Saudi king says you were supposed to put the next Ba'athist Sunni mustache in line in power, dummy. You weren't supposed to put the Shiite supermajority allied with Iran in power. Now what are we going to do? And Cheney said, don't worry, we'll start backing al-Qaeda again, starting right now. That was the policy that Obama inherited from George W. Bush. So, yes, Obama is guilty of treason. The same treason that he inherited from Bush. Now, to his credit, Donald Trump called this off. Donald Trump, and he's actually, no, that's not true. He called it off in Syria. He's still fighting a war for the Saudi al-Qaeda side in Yemen. But in Syria, he told the CIA to knock it off. And by the way, I asked a former CIA friend of mine that, hey, man, what did the CIA think when Trump canceled support for Jabhat al-Nusra and the jihadi terrorists in Syria? And he said, oh, they were all for it. They never supported that mission in the first place. They hated it. And they did it, or, you know, most of them anyway hated it. But they did it anyway because that's their damn job. But when Trump said we're not doing this anymore, they were only relieved. None of them were pissed off about that, you know. So, I mean, and think about that. This is the thing about Tulsi Gabbard, right? Is that Tulsi Gabbard, first of all, she's an Iraq war vet, so she understands who's on whose side. And apparently also she knows how to read and is interested in reading things about things. This gives her a huge advantage over these other people who they don't know their ass from their elbow. They don't know anything about who's on whose side over there. You know, pin them down and tell me all about Hezbollah. And they'll be like, they don't know anything. So, sorry, you should edit that out. I sounded really stupid there, but that was my impression of a Democrat. So Tulsi Gabbard can walk all over these people, and she's an Iraq War II vet, so they can try to smear her, but that's not going to go very far. When she fought on the, you know, essentially against the Sunni jihadist side in that war in the Anbar province, right? I mean, and 2 tours. So they're in a panic. You can already see they're in this huge panic over her. And I'm not saying that she's a total non-interventionist. She's not. But she's, you know what it is? She's a hawk on the war against al-Qaeda and ISIS. But she's totally against wars for al-Qaeda and ISIS because what the hell? She does not hate Iran more than she hates al-Qaeda. She'd be insane to. Well, the rest of the American establishment, they're insane. And they're heavily, of course, influenced by the Israeli view of this, which is that al-Qaeda, al-Shmeda, they're just some stupid militia somewhere at best ever. They're no threat. Iran is, at least in Israeli strategy, Iran is the threat to be isolated. And they don't give a damn who knocked our towers down. As Netanyahu himself said, and this is a legit quote, you can read it in Haaretz, about how the 9/11 attack, he said this immediately, that day, I believe, that the 9/11 attack, this will be great for Israel. And essentially, because they get to conflate their enemies with our enemies, even though they're on complete opposite sides. In fact, part of that McConnell thing accuses Iran of backing the Taliban. Well, look, Iran backs the Hazaras in Afghanistan. You know who else does? America. Iran almost invaded Afghanistan to destroy the Taliban before America did, back in 1999 when they killed a bunch of Iranian spies. Mm-hmm. And the Taliban are their enemy. And they're not Salafists, they're Hanafi Sunnis, but they're extremely conservative and extremely anti-Iranian influence and, you know, have, I don't know exactly all their relationship with the Hazaras in Afghanistan, but the Hazaras in Afghanistan are the Shiites, and they're allied with Iran. I'm saying I don't know exactly the Taliban's relationship with them, but the Iranians' relationship with them is support. And that was why they favored the American intervention in Afghanistan, just as they favored the American intervention in Iraq to get rid of Saddam for them. Right. So that's the other thing about it, right, is they can't even accuse these guys of anything that makes sense. That's why they always have to go back to 1983 when the Ayatollah, when Iran supported the Amal militia that attacked the Beirut barracks. But you know what? Ronald Reagan was selling them missiles within 3 years of that. Mm-hmm. So why the hell am I supposed to still be mad at them for that? That's crazy. That was when I was in 3rd grade.
Yeah.
And I have legit gray hairs now. I mean, not just on my chin, but all over my temples and things. It's nonsense. America fought an entire 2 wars for them in Afghanistan and especially in Iraq War II. And so now I'm supposed to be mad at them for accepting the gifts America gave them? I'm supposed to hate them more than the guys that knocked the towers down? No.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you know, another thing I was looking at, and you had mentioned how we employed Al-Qaeda in Syria, basically. And I was looking at it, and I was kind of studying like when this occurred, and I'm curious, have you looked at how much that had to do
with making it appear that Iraq was actually a success?
That American intervention in Syria was made to make Iraq look like a success.
No, getting Al-Qaeda to arming and funding Al-Qaeda to go fight in Syria, to like, you're basically deploying Al-Qaeda into Syria to get them out of Iraq and to make Iraq look successful.
Oh, I see what you mean. No, and I'll tell you why. Because the thing of it was, at that point, there was still a Sunni insurgency in Iraq, but it was, essentially defeated.
Okay.
America fought for the supermajority in the Civil War. So in that sense, we quote unquote won, except that the guys that we won the war for told us, thanks, now get the hell out because we like Iran better than we like you. And so, which we all saw coming for years, by the way. So it's all the Republicans' fault for doing that the way that they did it.
Right.
But so at the point where Obama started backing the Sunni insurgency in Syria, the Sunni insurgency in Iraq was pretty much licked. And the al-Qaeda jihadists there had been marginalized not by the Americans or the Shiite government, but by the Sunni tribal chiefs and former Ba'athist leaders so the Sunni insurgency, or maybe even you could say post-war or post-invasion, not just the insurgency, but overall post-invasion, the three major pieces of power in predominantly Sunni Western Iraq. So that's the former Ba'athist commanders under Saddam Hussein, the tribal chiefs, and then the al-Qaeda bin Ladenite suicide bomber guys. So, and they were, the three parts. So what happened was the first two turned on the third, because the suicide bomber Zarqawiyite lunatics had basically helped them lose the war. They had picked a fight with the Shia so badly, massacring Shiite civilians in such a way as to provoke an incredible cleansing campaign, a horrifying cleansing campaign by the Shiites backed by the Americans against them. And again, the Shiites were the 60% supermajority, the Shiite Arabs there. And so the Sunnis were bound to lose that war once it really got started. But the Zarqawiyites essentially were counterproductive from their own point of view, the bin Ladenites. So their goose was cooked. I mean, that's the essential irony of Syria, is that just as Obama is killing Osama, he's saying, oh, well, now that Osama's dead, now, like a political talking point, the war on terrorism is over. Al-Qaeda doesn't exist anymore. So now it's okay to back Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Libya, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, and bring these exact groups back to life. And so, in fact, the only real difference it made that Osama was dead was that it freed Baghdadi up to say, screw you, Zarqawi, I don't have to do what you say anymore, when he would have deferred to Osama. So the decapitation against Osama, if anything, helped lead to the rise of the Islamic State in a worse way than what have you. But yeah, so right at 2011, the spring of 2011, this is when the Arab Spring is breaking out. The Navy SEALs kill Osama. They finally get him. And then right then he starts backing them in Libya and then in Syria. And then the idea was, and you know what? I'm not exactly sure, because there's some different journalism about this. It's really hard to get straight answers about this kind of discussion or anything like that. But I think it's really pretty easy to understand how in the National Security Council meetings, in the Obama Oval Office and White House, where they discuss this stuff, that they just refuse to really take this on in the terms of the way I'm explaining it. That really, if it wasn't for American support for so-called moderates who ended up just running money and guns for the al-Qaeda guys who were doing the fighting in that war, Assad would have won that war in 2011. It would have been over before it started. Certainly in 2012 at the absolute latest. And imagine an American president having anything but this to say to our Sunni allies in Saudi, in Qatar, in Turkey, and of course, Israel, part of that same axis, that like, listen, guys, we know you hate Iran. We know you hate Assad. We know you hate Hezbollah, but we hate Al-Qaeda. We hate bin Ladenite, Zarqawiyite, insurgent militias. And our priority is making sure that they do not exist. And so, no, you will not back an insurgency in Syria because we say so. What's the point of being the hegemon? We can start any war we want, but we can't stop one. Why couldn't Barack Obama tell the Israel lobby, tell John McCain, tell the King of Saudi Arabia, tell the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Turkey? No, we're not doing this. Because, as Hillary Clinton herself said, there is no real opposition other than a bunch of al-Qaeda terrorists. As her State Department said in 2012, al-Nusra is just an alias for al-Qaeda in Iraq. Mm-hmm. That's all it is. It's the Zarqawiites. They were dead. And then Obama gave them the electric paddles. What do you call the electric paddles to shock to the chest thing? The defibrillator.
Yeah.
Obama saved them from extinction and turned them not just into an insurgency against Assad, but even into the Islamic State, which then he had to start another Iraq war to fight and destroy them, which took 3 years and killed another few 100,000 people.
Yeah. So do you think that Trump's actually going to stand up and demand that we go ahead and continue the pull out of Syria? Or do you think that all this this movement in Congress basically calling him irresponsible in his foreign policy, do you think this is going to halt him? Do you think it's going to stop him in his tracks?
No, it's on. No, it's done. No, you can read two great pieces in the American Conservative about this. One of them is by Gareth Porter, which is like reading between the lines, interpreting the statements of different officials. And then the other one is great original reporting by Mark Perry. And both of them conclude that this is absolutely happening. And Mark Perry, he's got the scoop. Mark Perry says that when Trump was in Iraq, he was meeting with the commander of the war in Syria, of the American effort, military effort on the other side of the line there. And that he looked him right in the eye and he I guess he says he asked for a briefing. Tell me everything that's going on. The generals told him, we've got ISIS down to their very last few men in the Euphrates Valley, and we're going to be done murdering them in no time flat, sir. And then Trump said to them, I want out. Yeah. Get that done. We're leaving. And they said, yes, sir. That's it. And as Mark Perry put it, they didn't seem to think there was any ambiguity. And unlike some, MSNBC lunatic or something, it never would occur to them that they would do anything but exactly what this man said to them. Right. That's it. He's their president, period. So they're done. They're packing up their stuff. And Perry says, yeah, you see reports that go, oh, look at what a scam. They're sending more troops to Syria. Those are the pack up everything bureaucrats. You need a whole new brigade for that. Everybody knows that. Somebody has to catalog all the equipment. Somebody has to be in charge of tearing it all down. The guys who are there now, that's not their job. There are other Army guys who have that job. And yes, they are being deployed there to wrap things up. And so,
we're not just
I don't think
leaving
there's any
everything
coming
behind?
back from that. I'm sorry?
I said, you mean we're not just leaving everything behind like we always do?
Right. Yeah, no. In this case, no. I mean, and they may only be moving it to the Iraq side of the border.
Yeah.
But
because they're going to keep, 5,000 troops in Iraq?
Yeah, except the Iraqis are saying get out because Trump went and said, why are we in Iraq? He couldn't point to ISIS anymore. ISIS is defeated. I thought there's a very low-level insurgents. I'm sorry?
I thought they decided we were staying in Iraq to keep Iran in check. Wasn't that?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Except as soon as Trump said that, the government of Baghdad, which, again, George Bush put in charge, which is, again, made up of Iran's best friends in Iraq, not just that they're Shiites, but from the Supreme Islamic Council and the Dawa Party, and their current leaders from the Supreme Islamic Council, al-Mahdi, and is very close to Iran. And as soon as he heard Trump say that, he said, you got to go then, because that was never the terms of our agreement. And Muqtada al-Sadr is a very important Shiite leader he's no Ayatollah himself. And they always say he's close to Iran, close to Iran, close to Iran. The reality is that he's an Iraqi nationalist, and he would like to limit Iranian influence as well as American influence. And he is a hard liner about, one, supporting Iraqi prime ministers, but on the condition that they insist that the Americans go. And he was a big part of getting America kicked out at the end of Iraq War II. And, he is insisting, and more there's a outcry in the Iraqi Shiite government parliament to kick us out then. And then, honestly, as long as Barack Obama doesn't come back and start backing the Sunni insurgency in Syria again, there's no reason to think that anything like the Islamic State could ever take hold in Western Iraq again. And the reason I'm so confident about all this is just because I covered it in real time as it was all happening. And so for the first few years of the Sunni insurgency in Syria, Patrick Coburn was coming on the show. This great, he's the best war reporter in the West anyway, covering the Middle East. And he'd come on the show and go, yeah, so I was just talking with all the Shiite ministers in Iraq, in Baghdad, and they were telling me that American support for the Sunni insurgency in Syria is, in their words, re-energizing the Sunni insurgency here in Iraq and creating a real problem for the Shiite government, which is just barely hanging on to the Sunni territory. And in fact, Patrick Coburn, in the spring of 2013, said he'd been to Mosul in northwestern Iraq in predominantly Sunni Stan, almost entirely Sunni Arabs in that area, and other smaller minorities, but not Shiites. And he'd been up there, and that the Iraqi army was essentially AWOL, that they were back safe behind Shiite lines because they felt like they were way out there on Fort Apache with no supply lines to back them up and without the real equipment and manpower necessary for their own force protection, never mind lording it over people and making them do anything. And so they were like cutting and running. AWOL, back behind Shiite lines. So what did this mean? This meant that as the Sunni insurgency in Syria is blowing up into a full al-Qaeda-led suicide bomber fest, and as the Islamic State, get this, a terrorist group that calls themselves a state, are now consolidating a state right at that time, spring 2013, are consolidating a state in eastern Syria. So here I am talking to Patrick Coburn, and I go, well, here you go. You see what's next. They're going to roll right into Western Iraq. Western Iraq is wide open. Predominantly Sunni Iraq is wide open for the Islamic State to come and conquer the place. And then right as we're talking about that, it turns out that there's a DIA report from August 2012. They're a little bit behind my curve on my show, a little bit behind the Patrick Coburn curve. Maybe they're reading Patrick Coburn. And there's a DIA memo that says, my God, our allies, their plan is really to create this Islamic State in eastern Syria. And the danger is that they could invade Western Iraq and take it over. So all of this was just the most nightmarish, slowest motion train wreck. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people killed in this thing. On top of what happened in Iraq War II. Iraq War II was 1 million. This is another 500,000 at least, probably, if you count them all up. I don't know, maybe not. But hundreds of thousands of people certainly have been killed in this thing. And all for nothing. And Assad is still there.
Yeah.
The whole Islamic State thing, it blew back so badly, they had to turn around and destroy the thing they'd created. And you know what? You can find John Kerry and his aide meeting. It's a secret audio recording of them by some Syrian rebel types. And you got to find the unedited version of it. I think the New York Times took out the good parts, but you can find it. And John Kerry and his aide are explaining to the Syrian rebels in 16. And they go, look, man, I'm sorry. I know you guys want more help, but pretty much the game is up. You want more guns? We gave you guns. We gave you so many guns. You want money? We gave you all this money. And you know what? Frankly, we saw the rise of Islamic State, but we thought we could manage. That should be on John Kerry's tombstone. We thought we could manage the rise of the Islamic State because we thought that we could use that to pressure Assad to negotiate to leave office. But that didn't work. Instead, he just went to Vladimir Putin and asked for help. and Putin gave it. He went to Iran and to Hezbollah and said, save us, and they did. And so, sorry, guys, we're not – and essentially he's especially emphasizing Russia here. And he's saying essentially we're not going to war with Russia over you guys. Our bluff has been called. Our plan did not work, and so we're sorry. We got to – what can I say?
Yeah.
So, and imagine that, seriously, not just how horrible that is in terms of allowing the creation of the caliphate, this used to be George W. Bush's most retarded war propaganda circa 2004. What caliphate? There are secular states everywhere. Where's this caliphate fit? It's like the lost city of Atlantis. There is no land area where it is. So shut up. This was bin Laden's wildest dream that could never come true. Their borders drawn. And then they allow this to happen deliberately? In John Kerry's own words, they not allowed. They made this thing. And then he says the reason why was to pressure Assad to resign. I'm sorry. It's possible. Seriously, dude, it's possible that I just didn't go to Georgetown and I just don't understand foreign policy right. And
we're just not smart enough.
Makes sense. But that does not make sense to me. What if the Europeans intervene on the side of the Confederacy in the American Civil War, and then they said, we think this is going to pressure Abraham Lincoln to step down? You would say, what the fuck are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. If anything, Abraham Lincoln is going to kill an extra few 100,000 people for that.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to make the war worse. But you're going to what? He's going to resign in favor of who? Somebody chosen by the French? He's going to go, you're right, French. You guys can choose our new leader because you put pressure on me by backing my opposition in the South.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah,
what textbook said that that's how you do this? That doesn't make any sense at all. And look at how it played out. Everyone who said it didn't make any sense was right, and Assad is still sitting in the chair.
Yeah, I was really concerned that the bombing that happened in Syria a couple of weeks ago after Trump announced he was leaving, that was going to be like one of those gas attacks, and everybody was going to be like, "Oh, see, we got to stay now," and it was just going to turn into a big disaster.
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the suicide bombing that killed the soldiers there?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, they tried that. But then, Trump turned it around. They're like, no, we're leaving. That way this won't happen anymore.
The soldiers wouldn't be dead if they weren't there, so,
Right. And now here's the thing about it, right? So Trump is great on Korea. We could talk about that if you want to get back to it.
Yeah, actually, that was
great on Korea. He's pretty good on Afghanistan. Looks like he really is negotiating our way out of Afghanistan. He wants out of Syria, but he wants to stay in Iraq. He's continuing a war of genocide, a deliberate starvation campaign, a medieval-style starvation campaign against the civilian population of Yemen at the behest of the Saudis, which is an absolute scarlet war crime. It's just absolute. He should be buried under the supermax with Barack Obama for that. It is absolutely unforgivable. No matter if he ended every war but that one, he'd still be a absolute war criminal. Go down in history as one of the worst people ever call themselves an American for what he's done.
Was wondering,
and continue to do in Yemen.
I was wondering with the pullout of Syria, and negotiating with the Taliban in Afghanistan, if it's just the beginning of the dominoes starting to fall and we're going to be leaving Yemen as well.
I mean, maybe. It sure should be. I mean, I'll tell you what, too, like as just a political thing, if he wants to win re-election, the way to – and we have so many wars. He could end a war every quarter, essentially, every 3 months. Until the election. And he'd be Trump the Great. And he'd just get up there and be like, God, geez, I lost track of all the wars I ended. And people would be carrying him around on their shoulders, and he'd be Trump the Great for all time. But I don't think he has the wisdom to see that, really. I think he's going to do this, and he's just horrible on Iran. Just horrible. And the whole establishment is, and he doesn't know why he shouldn't be. Certainly the entire Israel lobby demands it, and why displease them?
Well, and he loves Israel.
I don't think
Nobody
he really
loves
wants
Israel
a war
more
with
than
him.
him.
I'm sorry?
No, nobody loves Israel more than him. He's better on Israel than anybody. He's the best.
That's right. Yeah, and you know what? I don't think he really wants a regime change there, but he certainly doesn't want to make peace with them, and his stances could create a war. And the sanctions truly are an act of war. If you look at what he's trying to do to their economy, to the people of their country, it's just crazy. It doesn't have to be this way at all. He could get on a plane today and go and land in Tehran and go shake hands with the Ayatollah and just say, you know what? Everything in the world is the Bush family's fault or something. I don't know. I don't care either. Let's just be friends, pal. And then just whatever. They can just do whatever they want. They don't have to. Why should Donald freaking Trump, of all humans, who ever lived, this guy, why should he be bound by anything anybody did or said before that says that this is the way things have to be? I mean, look at what's going on in Korea. This is over George W. Bush and Barack Obama's dead body. This is everything they would have never done in a million years, those two. That they did everything they could to prevent. And Donald Trump's like, forget this. I'm making friends with this guy. Why shouldn't he? And if he can make friends with Kim, who really is the world's worst dictator in terms of the human rights abuse. I mean, they have a totalitarian state there in North Korea, probably the last true totalitarian state on earth. It is an absolute nightmare. So we have to make friends with them. The best way to stop that is to make friends with them, to normalize relationships with them, to open them up in every way that we can to trade and culture and technology and every other thing, and save their people and distribute food to them, man, first and foremost. Absolutely. Do business and make everything okay there. And Trump is saying, why shouldn't I? So absolutely the same thing applies to Iran. Israel is the only fly in that ointment. That's it. I mean, you have all these generals and all these people making money off of being hogs who they like the Cold War against Iran too, I guess. But if it wasn't for Israel and their strategy of demonizing Iran, this is the frustrating thing too, is it used to be that they were friends with Iran. Even after the Iranian Revolution, the Israelis got along with the Ayatollah and his regime just fine. The more smack they talked about each other actually was just cover for how well they were truly getting along in a covert way. Then the Israelis they changed their strategy from their periphery doctrine of supporting, this is support the Turks and the Ethiopians and the Iranians and I don't know who all else, as, to keep the Arabs front divided on opposite sides and that kind of thing, right? And balance against all the Arabs that are closer. Well, so they changed that in the early 90s under Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, his, I guess, deputy or whatever it was. They were working together. And they started demonizing Iran in order to cut a deal with the Arabs. And particularly over Palestine, to try to – not that they were really going to give full independence to the Palestinians, but they wanted to give up what they thought would be good enough to be considered a Palestinian state and end the question of the annexation of the West Bank or letting the Palestinians have whatever is left of it at that point and that kind of thing. And so but that didn't really work. And part of the reason it didn't work is the Iranians started backing Hamas and other rejectionist groups in order to thwart it from the Palestinian side. Since they were the ones getting screwed, they had an interest in playing it that way. But then so Sharon and Netanyahu come to power. It was actually a Netanyahu fan that murdered Rabin. But then when Sharon and Netanyahu come to power, they keep the demonize Iran part, but they forget about the make peace with the Palestinians part. So now they're just bad on everything. They're not even favoring one side or the other. They're just getting America essentially to do all the heavy lifting for them in opposing everybody. And this is a big part of in the 1990s, the strategy of dual containment. America has to keep our troops in Saudi Arabia in order to contain Iraq and Iran. Well, they're enemies. Why not let them balance each other? That was the policy before. I mean, assuming intervention at all here, assuming American domination of the Middle East as a premise and all other things being equal, then why can't you dominate the Middle East from aircraft carriers offshore? Why do you have to stay in bases in Saudi and drive Osama crazy, make him want to knock your towers down when these in order to contain two enemy countries that are next door to each other. It was only because that's what Israel wants, and it was their policy. It was born in Israel and funneled through the Israel lobby and Martin Indyk in the Clinton administration that did that, and that was what got the towers knocked down. That was what really inspired the al-Qaeda war against the United States, was the permanent occupation of Saudi Arabia in order to contain Iraq, especially to bomb Iraq and enforce the blockade there, when Clinton could have made peace with both of them, or could have made, relative peace with them, coexistence, but not friendship or whatever type relationship with both of them, and instead had this Cold War policy against them both, or warm war. They're bombing Iraq the whole time and blockading. That's not quite Cold War. It's something else, but it's worse. But so much of this is tied up with what they think their strategy ought to be and what therefore they think American strategy ought to be. And so here we are.
Yeah. Oh shit. Okay. I don't know, man. Like it doesn't really make much sense to me that America puts so much emphasis on backing Israel at America's expense, but I don't really understand like the continuation of NATO as well, and why we feel like we have to, militarize and arm Ukrainians. So I don't know. It's pretty crazy. I don't see why we should be fronting the bill on any of these things. Why it's our responsibility in the first place.
Well, we shouldn't be. We shouldn't be. I mean, if you're looking for an answer that's going to satisfy you as being good enough for you, not to be true, but to like convince you to support it too, you're never going to find that.
Right.
You essentially, you need a vested interest is what you need. And then you'll see that, all of a sudden America is exceptional, which means that now sins are okay, or whatever that means. Now we can do whatever we want. Because it essentially comes down to the economics of government contracting, right? The arms dealers, the think tanks, the oil companies, the banks, those who are making the money off the wars, they back the institutes that write the policies that say why we have to do this all the time. And it's all just it's a racket is all it is,
Well, it really feels like to me that it's just a continuation of the British colonialism, and I don't really notice it in history being really prominent until Theodore Roosevelt is in office, and it looks to me what happened was, because that was right around the time of the Progressive era, and you had a lot of these big corporate business owners, big bankers coming over to America and trying to sell different ideals as far as politics go. You had, the beginning of the Prussian education system, and you had all these different things happening as these big corporate owners came over here and began to acquire power within the government. And it really feels like it's just a continuation of the colonialist system, if I can talk, and how they're looking to enrich their corporate donors in order to continue to enrich themselves in politics. And it's just become the norm, and it has nothing to do with defense.
That's right. I mean, look, they call it a mixed economy, a quasi-free market, meaning it's corrupt from bow to stern. The whole thing is, it's what Henry Clay called the American system.
Right.
It's always been like this. It's welfare for the rich,
right.
Essentially.
Yeah.
And the best way and the fastest way to make a buck is to have a war, because that's where you get the real big ticket items, the giant ships, the planes, and all the bonds that are issued in order to service the debt and all of the money made in the transfer of wealth from the American people to the people who make war.
Right. And truly it's I meant to tell you this earlier, but okay. So before I did my episode on Rothbard, and then I heard you on Pete's show, you mentioned in both the clip you sent me and in his episode, the Rothbard essay on Left and Right, the Prospects for Liberty. And I hadn't read
great
that.
one.
I hadn't read that. So when I was listening to you talk about it with Pete, I went ahead and paused the episode. I said, I'm reading it right now. So I took an hour and 15 minutes, whatever it took, and I read it before I finished the show. And yeah, it blew my mind. And I look at it now, and I'm looking at it, and it's like what Rothbard was calling in that essay. He was calling it American fascism, and that's the more I look at what he was saying in that essay, and I look around, just over the last couple of days, just looking around at the political environment. I mean, even like you here lately, we've had the Green New Deal on the radar, and I'm like, wow, that really is a time of fascism. Like, I didn't even look at it that way, and I'm like, Jesus, so whenever I look at what was going on with the wars and how they've pursued these wars to enrich the corporations, and they always use the term, they don't use defense when they talk about these wars. They always use the term American interests. Well, if you want to consider enriching American corporations at the expense of other nations in America's best interest, I guess that's what they're talking about. But they understand that as these corporations enrich themselves, like we were talking about the oil industry in Venezuela, United Fruit, or, the poppy fields, and taking charge of these poppy fields and getting big pharma, good deals on making heroin and all these things. When you're talking about this, yeah, it's American interest in the fact that it enriches those elites at the top. But what does it do to the average citizen? And you start looking at that, and you realize the average citizen are the ones that are losing their kids, to these evils within the world. And I think that's the most destructive part of the entire thing, because the elites and the corporations, they control all the media devices and all the propaganda outlets, and they have the mainstream in their hip pocket. And so you hear the people that are negatively affected by these policies defending the policies that are negatively affecting them, and it's really frustrating.
Right. I mean, like we're talking about with the Sunni-Shia war over there in the Middle East. This is the perfect example of this, where the American interest, assuming anything is legit about the national security state at all, would be in, I wouldn't even say fighting Al-Qaeda guys, but for God's sake, at least doing what we can to discourage our allies from supporting them, put it that way, something, not really intervention against them, because I think that all backfires anyway, but certainly not supporting them. But that any American who thinks that their opinion about what should be the priority would reflect the priorities of the American government, well, they see themselves immediately discouraged and mistaken. Like, well, but America's government has a much different agenda than avenge the dead of 9/11 or something like that. No, their agenda is to dominate the Middle East, and Al-Qaeda is not what's a threat to that. Iran is what's a threat to that. Iran declared independence. You want to go with the English analogy here, the British Empire. They declared independence from America in 1979. And that is, the genesis of American enmity with them, and that we cannot forgive. And we could get along with them, but we'd have to respect their independence. And they're just not willing to settle for that. And yet, who possibly could be convinced that America could get away with another 1953 type coup d'etat and install an American-friendly monarch over those people for another 25 years? I mean, that's insane. That's never going to happen. And if they're ever to have a government that prefers to go along with the United States in ways that America would like them to do, well, then the only reasonable choice is to kill them with kindness. It's not a regime change. It's to say to them, listen, Wherever we have interests, we should get along. Again, I'm arguing all things being equal in terms of the U.S. government over there and accomplishing its goals. Never mind, libertarian non-interventionism or any of that. I'm just saying, as far as the American government getting what it wants, even, they would just. Apparently, they would rather fight. They would rather have a Cold War against Iran. They would rather constantly throw temper tantrums about how mad they are that the Iranians keep benefiting from their policies. And that's in Iraq, in Syria, and in Yemen, too. Where in Yemen, Iran, without lifting a finger, gets credit for every victory that the Houthis accomplish in 4 years of war. And they don't have to do anything except say, yeah, we support the Houthis or whatever. And then they get called, the Houthis get called Hezbollah and part of the Iranian axis and whatever, which isn't even true at all.
Yeah.
So,
you
can see why the neocons are upset, but it's all their own fault. That's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the Americans' interest would be in keeping the jihadists down. The American government's interest is keeping the Iranians down on the other side of that same fight. And that's why they always try to conflate the two and just confuse you. Iran, the greatest supporter of terrorism. You mean Iran, the greatest enemies of ISIS. Oh, okay. Yeah. Starting to get a little bit of context changes the entire narrative.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said the neocons aren't real happy with, what's going on. Well, my friend, he's a comedian. He lives in Austin. His name's Eric Nimmer, and he has a great line about this. And he said, Trump is exactly what happens when you go back after you go black. We tried to warn you. So they should have kept that in mind.
That's funny.
But you were talking about how it's not about the people who died on 9/11, and I think that's a really important point. And a few months back, you had one of your shows, one of your episodes was about. I may misstate this slightly, but it was about the FBI blocking the families of 9/11 victims trying to sue Saudi Arabia so that the White House could make business deals with Saudi Arabia. Do you remember much about that story?
Well, I know the first part of it was not the first part of what you said, but the first part of the story is that the 9/11 families fought like hell for years to be able to sue. And the courts tried to say that the Saudis had sovereign immunity and all of this stuff. James Baker III was the lead lawyer representing the Saudis for many years. Maybe still is involved, Baker Botts. And then the families got this passed by Congress. JASTA is what it's called. And I forget the exact acronym, what it stands for. But JASTA. And it's the bill that says that, yes, Americans can sue Saudi Arabia for their government's complicity in the 9/11 attacks, which, not to get all into the weeds on that, but it's clear that some people in their government supported the group at different times and possibly even the hijackers at different times. And so this is what they're pursuing. And the Congress passed it with a veto-proof supermajority so that Obama had no choice but to sign it. And he opposed it and tried to stop them from doing it. And they couldn't. Essentially, the 9/11 families got it done from a public relations point of view that any senator or congressman dare not oppose them on this now. Maybe they could have killed it in committee at some point back when or this or that, but under the current circumstances, you better pass this. And they knew it, and so they did. And so I don't know where that stands with the Trump administration. That's the part I'm pleading ignorance on is Trump trying to prevent that from going through. I don't know. I don't know how he's supposed to make that happen, but
Yeah, I don't remember who it was you were interviewing, but they were talking about that the Trump administration had instructed the FBI to try to block the lawsuits by not opening up any of the information that the FBI had on the Saudis' involvement. And so they were trying to keep.
Well, that could turn into a real fight, man. I don't know, man. That could be really bad politics. Then again, it could get swept under the rug and ignored. That could also
I haven't
make
heard
for a
anything
real
about
fight.
it.
I haven't heard anything about it since your episode, and I think this is an
That's
episode
the first
you
I heard
recorded
was
in.
from you just now. So yeah.
No, you were talking to some guy in September about this.
Oh, about
'Cause I
Trump
remember-
intervening? What the hell?
about the FBI keeping the documents
Oh, okay.
under.
You learned that on my
yeah.
show? Well, what the hell do I know? Sorry.
No, it's
I
okay,
did not
it's okay.
remember
I
that.
can't
I did not remember that.
I can't remember who it was you were talking about, but I'll find the
I
show
bet
and
it
I'll
would have
put it in
been
the
Brian
show.
McGlinchey. Brian McGlinchey, the great. He's really great.
Man.
28pages.org. .com.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the
I
guy.
just thought that was-
He really, 28 pages, he really lobbied to focus on getting the 28 pages of the original congressional investigation, House and Senate joint congressional investigation of 9/11 released. The censored 28 pages about Saudi intelligence support for the 9/11, one of the 9/11 cells in the U.S. Although it does fall short of proving that they backed them with the intent of helping to accomplish the attack. It doesn't prove that, but it's pretty ugly looking. I don't know if you check it out, but
I haven't.
yeah, so
looked
he's
at
done
it,
really
but
great work on the
I've heard
Saudi
some
lobby in the U.S. since then as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was just curious if there was any updates on whether the families had gotten a hold of.
Oh, I
all
do
that
not.
information.
I really do not know. I should know, but I don't.
No, that's okay. We'll figure it out. Okay, so I got a couple more things here that I had notes on. Trump in the State of the Union, and you had talked to Pete about this on his show. He had mentioned the nuclear, I think it's the Intermediate Nuclear Treaty that the United States and Russia are commonly involved in. And what I've heard a few people say, and even some anarchists, not necessarily libertarian, but anarchist types, say that this was by Trump saying, "Oh, if you don't cooperate, we're going to pull out." It's actually a gift to Putin, because in the treaty, Russia was the only country to really give anything up, because all it states within the treaty is that there's not any nuclear facilities, even for defense purposes, allowed within the European continent and on European grounds. And therefore, since most of America's nuclear defenses are submarine and in water, that it doesn't really affect America that much. And so Trump is giving Russia an out on this treaty that he shouldn't be allowing, and that he should be a lot harder on Russia about complying with the treaty.
That's awesome, man. It is so cool the way. And it's a miracle of conspiracy thinking, right? Where everything is a Russian plot. Everything, no matter how anti-Russian it is secretly what the Russians wanted all along, and all this kind of stuff. It's
Right.
You gotta
you'd get a
really
kick
hand
out
it
of
to
this.
them in a way. It's like a cult belief, right? It's like it's, you know what it is? It's a wonderful exercise in question begging, right? In starting with your conclusion and then working from there. So if
Right.
Donald Trump is a secret Russian agent, then yeah, that makes total sense, dude. How nefarious. But no, in reality, the INF treaty went, and I don't know the entire history of this. I guess I need to go back and study up more. But I know that when the INF treaty was passed, that it was a huge deal, and that yes, it restricted the Russians, but it also restricted the Americans, and that they pulled nukes out of Germany and out of, I'm not exactly sure where else in Europe at the time, and that is, and by the thousands even. That this was a major step. It was a major part of the end of the Cold War, with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush both ended up signing treaty after treaty with the Soviet Union as it fell, and then with the new Russian Federation. In fact, George H.W. Bush, as a lame duck president, after the Russian flag went up and replaced the Soviet flag on Christmas Day 91 in early January, before Clinton was sworn in, Bush Sr. went back over there and signed another treaty to get rid of another 10,000 nukes or whatever it was on each side. So regardless of exactly the details, going back on any of that, as George Bush did with the anti-ballistic missile treaty as well, that going backwards on any of the deals with Russia in spirit as well as, in detail, is absolutely the wrong tack to take and ultimately leads to greater numbers of nuclear weapons. Now, in this case, they're saying that the Russians were in violation of the treaty, but from everything I read, if it's true, and they don't really exactly know for sure, but if it's true that these missiles are medium range and not short range, the Russians say, no, they only go 400 miles, not 6 or whatever is the technicality there. That they're still all deployed for China because China is full of intermediate range missiles pointed towards Russia. That's their deterrent to Russia. And so if anything, America should have negotiated in good faith with the Russians and maybe even with the Chinese. That, hey, let's nobody have medium range missiles. How do you like that? Except that, of course, China is a lot closer to Russia than we are. And so what good does a 3-stage ICBM do them when it comes to deterring the Russians? They kind of have their own deal. But there's no indication that I've seen that the Russians had a doctrine or a policy or a nefarious plan to secretly that these are about intimidating the Europeans and moving these to the European theater or something. That is all only within scaremongering and within the realm of possibility, but was not the case at the time. And so, I don't buy that at all. I think you would have to already accept that somehow Trump is an agent of Putin and that everything that he does in terms of the relationship with Russia must be read in a way to fit with that narrative rather than the obvious that he's just ratcheted up tensions with Russia. I guess, is it a secret Russian plot too that Russia controlled Trump and convinced him to arm the government of Ukraine where Barack Obama was afraid to? We're supposed to be scandalized that Trump's guys intervened to prevent hawks from making the Republican Party platform worse on this. But then Trump takes power and he starts arming the government of Ukraine, the coup d'etat junta that Obama's government installed there. But that Obama was afraid to arm because, their forces were committing war crimes and were praising Adolf Hitler. And so he was thinking maybe he shouldn't double down on that, or maybe only double but not quadruple. So here comes Trump 2-3 years after Minsk II, and the relative peace essentially had broken out there, in 2015, and essentially the end of the war there, and comes in and helps ratchet tensions right back up again. Is that because Putin told him to also? Or how about Putin supports Maduro in Venezuela? I guess maybe Trump is deliberately botching the coup in Venezuela that way to make it look like he's doing a coup, but really he's just helping Putin's guy, right? And this is nonsense. You could read anything you want that way if you choose to, but it's on you, not the reality, obviously.
Right.
And I don't mean you, but I mean one who was a fool.
Yeah, no, I saw this. It was somebody had written it on Facebook. And I saw it and I thought of you and I was like, next time I talk to Scott, I'm going to bring this up because this was an extremely long reach. And after I heard you talk to Pete about the INF treaty, I was like, oh man, that is just like direct polar opposite of what Scott thinks about what's going on with the INF.
Yeah.
So,
and it is true though that the Americans have even, I don't know exactly how you classify them, but you could call them I think even short range cruise missiles that can hit Moscow within a matter of minutes from the Baltic Sea. And so, it's not like there's no American deterrent to the Russians in Europe. We need to get rid of this treaty so that we can repopulate the European mainland with nukes. And it doesn't make any sense that America would want to do that anyway. I could see why the Poles want us to put nukes in Poland as a deterrent to Russia, but I can't see why that makes sense for American interests. Why should America have a war guarantee to any of these countries? And, by the way, it also raises the question, too, and we see this all the time. I don't know why the Europeans would be exempt from this, that America likes to make big promises and then stab people in the back and leave them high and dry. The Bay of Pigs is like a cliche now, where there's the Great Bay of Pigs in the desert in 1991, where Bush Sr. encouraged the the Shiite and Kurdish uprising against the Ba'athists and then betrayed them and let Saddam murder them all while they thought that he was going to back them up. You see us time and again arm and train and back the Kurds in a war and then turn around and leave them high and dry to be killed by Saddam or to be killed by the Turks, as could be coming up, although I think they'll strike a deal with Assad and prevent that. But anyway, America's betrayed the Kurds 2 major times at least in the 1970s under Nixon and Kissinger, and then again in 1991. And, they do this kind of thing. So now the NATO treaty says that, an attack on one is an attack on all, but there's some weasel words in there, and it does not override and automatically say that America or any of the NATO countries must go to war to reverse an act of war on any of the member states. It's not that specific. And even if it was, I don't know, cringe. I'd like to think that, if the question really came down to, are we going to trade Washington, D.C. for Warsaw? Assuming that some Russian Nazis replace Putin and march on Poland, are we going to get into a nuclear war? What about if they take the Baltic states? The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, right on Russia's immediate border, are members of NATO right now. And let's say some real right-wingers get elected, come to power in Russia in 5 years. Putin dies of a stroke, and some other guy who's even meaner than him comes in and says, hey, there's Russian-speaking minorities in these countries, and they're being treated poorly, and so we're going to do some regime change. Are we willing to go to H-bomb level extinction of humanity over that? Or is the reality that the Americans actually are not going to go to war? That we've given war guarantees essentially to a bunch of people. We've given an incentive, a moral hazard, as the economists would put it, to encourage them to misbehave and to act poorly as though we're going to back them up, when God only hopes that we only would hope that, no, we would not back them up. That we would say, sorry, Tallinn, that if the Russians are going to kill everybody in your capital city, we're still not going to have an H-bomb war over it. As Pat Buchanan points out, that during the Hungarian uprising and during the Prague Spring and during the Polish solidarity, that Ike Eisenhower, LBJ, and Ronald Reagan said, sorry, Charlie, you guys are on the wrong side of the line, man. We're not going to intervene in that. In fact, in Hungary, they'd really encouraged it. Go ahead and revolt. We'll back you up. And then, no, we won't. Not really. And so, that's a good reason to disband NATO. How about that? America doesn't really mean it. Yeah. We are not going to sacrifice New York City, maybe not even for Paris. Not that the Russians are coming to Paris, but I'm just saying.
Well, Paris got to take care of those yellow vests first.
Yeah, they got their own problems, and they got their own H-bombs, too. They have their own deterrent, by the way. And yes, Doug Bandow constantly says, if Russia's really a threat, then how come Germany can't muster the slightest effort to build up an infantry to oppose them? It's because they're not a threat. It's a lie. That's the answer. Because if it was real, the Germans would be arming. And they're not, because they don't need to, because there is no threat, because it's fake. Because America's the threat, not Russia.
Right. Well, and people misunderstand, and I've had conversations with people about these different types of things. And I think Lou Rockwell has a quote that stated it best, that basically he said, I'm not going to give in to the propaganda talking bad about the country that America wants to go to war with next. I don't have to agree with that country, but I'm not going to give into this propaganda and encourage the war effort.
Yeah, the only thing, sometimes, depending on the social psychology of the situation, you might need to disclaim a little bit, that just so you understand, so that there's no misunderstanding, no honest misunderstanding, right? Forget people who have a grudge or axe to grind or an agenda where they're going to ignore what you say. But to prevent any honest misunderstanding, I don't give a damn about Russia. I don't give a damn about Iraq. I'm not sitting here trying to sing to you the virtues of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party. I'm just trying to teach you what's the reality compared to a bunch of lies. And the fact is that reality has a severe anti-American bias. The U.S. government is a damn liar about everything. That's why my job is so easy. All I do is listen to what they say and say, you're a liar, and then explain it. And I win every time because I'm right and they're not. I don't have to be really, that intelligent. I just have to keep paying attention for a long time in a row. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and a lot of people, and I think you and I have discussed this before on the last time we recorded a podcast, a lot of people confuse the American government with America. And America is not the government. America is the people that live here. It is the ideas that this country was founded on, and
our government hates our guts. We know that. They hate us. They have nothing but the worst contempt for us. And you know what they do? Yep. They hide behind, well, this is what we told the media. Well, the media are the conveyors of the government statements to the public. Like that's how they diffuse their responsibility, that they're just lying to a bunch of stupid reporters who like being lied to. Well, I don't like being lied to,
Well, I mean, it gets so ridiculous because you look at like some of the things that they keep secret. It's like everything the government does. People don't understand this because they feel like they know so much about their government. But it's like, no, everything the government does is classified unless they declassify it. I remember hearing Glenn Greenwald talk about when he got the Snowden documents and he was going through those, and that like 60 or 70% of the documents were some innocuous thing, like somebody, asking for a vacation time or something like that. And all these documents are classified. There's no such thing as transparency unless it's something they want you to believe. That's the only time you hear anything from the government, is it's something they want you to believe.
Yep. That's pretty much true. Or that gets leaked, or, Freedom of Information Act type stuff. But yeah, it's true. Yeah. It's funny. Everybody says, or all the never Trumpers and whatever, their defense is that, well, there's no deep state. That's all a myth and whatever. But the whole effort is being led by the Washington Post, along with the FBI and CIA. And it was the Washington Post that featured the massive 3-part series by Dana Priest and William Arkin called Top Secret America. And it was about how never even mind the military-industrial complex from Ike Eisenhower through Bill Clinton. Just take the 21st century alone and the national security, homeland security, warfare state that has been built up, and the contractor state that has been built up in the name of the response to September 11th is essentially a mirror image, equal in size and in power to everything that came before it, in just, within just the Bush administration years, essentially. Right. That it has grown so far out of control. And as you're saying, it's all secret. Nobody knows anything about it. It's virtually all classified. All we know is it's trillions of dollars. And Kelly Vlahos wrote this thing, and there may be some other stuff along these lines too. But Kelly Vlahos wrote this great thing for the American Conservative a year or so or two ago, about how all of these really nice neighborhoods around Washington, D.C., in Maryland and in Virginia, especially, I guess, in Virginia, that these really great neighborhoods were being completely bulldozed, and these really nice houses completely bulldozed and replaced with even bigger houses, these giant McMansions and this kind of thing. And this was going on for tens and tens and tens and tens of square miles all around in every way. And that it's a revolution in the culture of the country, essentially. If you think that Woodrow Wilson moved the financial center of America from New York to D.C., or the FDR did, it's such a distortion in wealth and who gets it and for what, that it just makes an absolute mockery out of the idea of a free and open society, a limited government, a free market, or anything like that. It is, as you say, quoting Rothbard there, it's fascism. It's American fascism. It's not exactly the same as in Italy. Why would it be? But, Robert Higgs, the great libertarian economist, extremely serious guy and good on everything. I mean, he's really great. He says, well, it's a participatory fascism. So, you can run for office and everything, but it ain't going to stop being a mixed economy. And that's what it is. And that means a rigged one. And now it's just rigged beyond measure. And up to and including, this massive spying, as you're talking about, and total lawlessness. Certainly in the Bush administration, the Obama administration was hardly better. Well, they were quite a bit better, but still bad on torture, where they just decided, I mean, as the Bush administration guys put it, that the president, as commander in chief, he can override any law, any treaty, any provision of the Constitution other than the words shall be commander in chief. That's it. Everything else is, somehow he can evade it. And, the court rolled back some of that. The Supreme Court rolled back some of that in terms of Guantanamo, holding people without trial and that kind of thing. But much of that doctrine still stands. It's another thing. Robert Higgs, he's most famous for his book Crisis and Leviathan, where he talks about the ratchet effect and how with each crisis the government gains in power. Then when the crisis passes, sometimes some of the power gets a little bit relaxed, but it never goes back to the way it was before. And so it's just like turning a ratchet, click, click, click back, and then a tightening, and then a click, click, click back, and then a tightening, and that you never really roll back and get things back the way they were. So, and then throughout American history, crisis after crisis after crisis, we see expansions of laws, whole new government departments, whole new taxes, whole new ways of doing things, whole new massive distortions in the process of the economy. And then, of course, the boom and the bust cycle that's generated by the central banking that's at the core of it all.
Yeah, well, I laughed a while ago. You brought up Robert Higgs. Did you see this open letter to Ocasio-Cortez he wrote?
Oh, no, but it sounds fun.
Oh, it's hilarious. Let me read it to you real quick. It's not real long.
Oh, cool. Please do.
Yeah, it's let me see if I can. All right, noticing that pretty much
so
everything.
Great, by the way.
Yeah, he's hilarious.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I still had 1 second to
No, you're
cram
good.
One more statement in there. Go ahead.
All right, so this is a memo from Robert Higgs. He says, noticing that pretty much everything you say about economic matters is mistaken, I would like to offer you some advice about how you can avoid such errors. The first thing you should learn is called opportunity cost. This is explained in the first chapter of any economics textbook. With an understanding of this concept under your belt, you can eliminate a large part of your errors. There are other important ideas you should master, but unless you gain a command of the concept of opportunity cost, you are destined to make a fool of yourself almost any time you talk about economic matters. Incidentally, you might consider suing for malpractice the people responsible for awarding you a degree in economics at Boston University. For what it's worth, I have 2 degrees in economics, a bachelor's and a PhD. For the record, I note that neither degree was granted by Boston University. My economics undergraduate training at San Francisco State College in the mid-1960s left much to be desired, but it was not completely worthless. In any event, I did not use it as the launching pad for advancing a master plan for a government takeover of the world. Even in 1965, I would have thought such a proposal preposterous and my promotion of it ridiculous. If your grand plan rests implicitly or explicitly on the assumption that economic resources are not scarce, your plan does not deserve any consideration whatsoever. You might as well assume that gravity does not exist, or that with sufficient political will, people can run faster than the speed of light.
My God. Yeah, man, I'll tell you. And, I haven't had the time. I only read the first paragraph of that thing and I busted out laughing like, oh my goodness, this is just completely ridiculous here.
Yeah.
That, I think it's the second paragraph where she says we could just get rid of the military, half of the military in a year. We could just cancel all of it, bring all the troops home from all the bases in order to do this. And I'm like, man, all right. She gets off to a great start, but then unfortunately she seems to kind of discredit that as the magical thinking of some nitwit who thinks the rest of these things that she thinks. Which is an entirely separate question, but ends up getting mixed in there. Because we don't need a Pentagon at all. I mean, we could entirely abolish the American Standing Army and the American Intelligence Services, and we'd be better off for it. And you might say, yeah, but then wouldn't Mossad just walk all over us all day long? And I would say they would have nothing to gain really from doing it. If we didn't have an empire to serve them, then they would have to just go target somebody else, because otherwise they'd just be wasting their resources trying to convince us to do something for them that we just don't want to do. So we really don't need – that's the whole thing. That's why I like Jacob Hornberger so much. Jacob Hornberger will just say the same thing every time. He goes, look, after World War II, under Harry S. Truman, the national security state was grafted onto our republic and ruined everything. And so what we need to do is just completely abolish the national security state. That's the Pentagon and the CIA and all of them. And all their stupid laws and all of their permanent wars, and just not be like that. We could be a normal country in a normal time. And you know what, too?
Right.
And I don't know if this is a Hornbergerian thing or this is just mine, but it seems to me like one of the most important founding myths of America, and there's some truth in it, is that George Washington could have been king. And then instead, he, like Cincinnatus, the Roman general, he went home to his farm. And then they called him back later to be chief administrator of the new republic, which was kind of a coup over the articles. Okay, let's not be naive, but still.
Right.
Compared to him just saying, all right, well, as commander of the victorious army, I'm now the king of America or whatever. He didn't try that even. That there was power at his disposal that he denied because it wouldn't be the right thing to do. And that's obviously the role that America should play in the world. The could-be superpower that doesn't want to be one, because let the English go destroy their own society, murdering everybody else in the world. That's just not our thing. It shouldn't be our thing at all. And unfortunately, and a lot of this has to do with government school, but also just I think learning all this stuff in school as a kid, being taught by adults who made all the decisions, that essentially everything that ever happened had to be that way, because obviously a bunch of great adults who know what they're doing use their democracy to decide to make it that way. So what are you saying? They're wrong? No. And so everything comes with legitimacy in a perfect question begging way, right? Where everything starts out legitimate first, and then you got to figure out why it all makes sense somehow to back it all up.
Well, and you're supposed to believe that America is this knight in shining armor riding in on a white horse to slay the evil dragon, no matter where they intervene.
Yeah, exactly. They say it's a dangerous world. Well, I mean, is it really? Look at a globe and identify the threat. All of Europe are our allies. The Russians are essentially our partners and lowercase f friends, maybe. The same for the Chinese. And then that's it. There are no other powers on Earth. We ran out of even possible powers to oppose us anywhere. The Japanese are our friends. They were a power once upon a time, but come on. There's nothing to fight about. Can you imagine that? It's not a dangerous world. The only reason it's a dangerous world is because America mercilessly murders Muslims to the point where some of them would commit terrorist acts against us. But even then, look at their desperation. One nut with a AR-15 at a city council meeting in San Bernardino, or a government office birthday party or whatever in San Bernardino, or even on 9/11, where they have to hijack our airliners to even have a weapon to use to create massive casualties. I mean, I'm not playing down the seriousness of that. I'm just playing it down compared to the hype that represents an existential threat to our civilization or something like that. No, it doesn't.
Right.
And you know what?
A guy with a malfunctioning bomb in his underwear or whatever.
Right. Well, or even take 9/11, the worst example, where they had to take our our weapon to – I'm sorry, I had a brilliant thing to say, but instead I'll just repeat myself.
No, I'm sorry.
They had to use our technology and our equipment essentially to carry out the attack, and only then to provoke an overreaction, to provoke America to shooting itself in its own 2 feet, rather than, actually taking us down or posing a real threat. And so, yeah, in other words, in the parallel dimension where, I don't know, Michael Dukakis won in 88 or something, and we never did Iraq War I. And the Cold War, it didn't start off. Never mind Paradise, where Ron Paul won in 88. He ran as the Libertarian candidate that year, by the way. Never mind that, like Paradise under a Ron Paul administration at the end of the Cold War. But even if you just not gotten off on the policy of total domination of the Middle East from bases in the Middle East and ground forces there and all those kinds of things in that way, things could have been so much different. And even after September 11th, where – now, they could have negotiated for Osama bin Laden, but even if the Americans were just so damn mad that they had to bomb somebody and bomb the Taliban for even being friends with Osama in the first place and this kind of thing, they still could have called off that war by Christmas Day. They essentially let Osama go. They refused to commit the forces to really catch Osama. But even then, they decimated his organization. They'd driven him further into exile where he couldn't possibly really do anything to us. They could have declared victory right then. You didn't have to have a war on terrorism in the 21st century at all. You didn't have to have a single regime change. Not in Iraq, not in Yemen, not in Libya, not in Syria, not any of this. None of it had to be this way at all. And Trump himself has said this too. Trump, the Republican president of the United States, has said that George Bush going into the Middle East, not just invading Iraq, but essentially kicking over the whole damn anthill over there in a way, that was the worst decision an American president ever made. Now, that's a little bit of hyperbole compared to Woodrow Wilson. I don't know, maybe a couple more. But you know what? Essentially, he's right. That was a huge unforced thing, to start a war. He absolutely did not have to. And for the most personally self-interested reasons, trying to prove he's tougher than his old man and smarter than his old man. I told my dad go all the way to Baghdad, he would have been reelected. Watch me, I'm going to do it this time. I'm going to show him. And then all of these, corrupt and venal people, the neocons and their Likud party, Dick Cheney and his Halliburton friends, who he needed to pay off for being such a lousy CEO. Donald Rumsfeld and his transformation of the military doctrine and all of these things. None of this had to do with defending the American people. None of this had to do with a necessity to start a war, to pretend it was a preemption of an imminent attack on the United States by Iraq. You got to be kidding me. And there's, by the way, 250 million people knew better too. So anybody who says, oh, well, everybody thought that we had to do it, that's not true. Essentially, half the people said this is crazy. We should not be doing this. And the other half of the people said, why don't you want to attack Saddam, who attacked us on 9/11, you commie pinko traitors? Because they were stupid and they believed the Republicans, and the Republicans were lying to them. And they were believing those lies. And, by the way, this is kind of an aside, and I need to maybe research this more and develop this point a little bit more and what have you. But I really think that a lot of the current left-right hatred and extreme kind of, hard feelings between each and everybody essentially politically in this country really goes back to that. I mean, people were divided in the Clinton years and all that. But, when it was Bush versus Gore and people were fighting over that, it was like, people weren't fighting that hard about it because they were clones of each other. There wasn't much difference in the year 2000 to see between the two. The center had the loyalty of the major left and right factions of America, for good or for ill. And so much of that has dissolved because of Iraq War II. Because seriously, half the population, and eventually more than that, because people rationalize backwards. Well, why would we be – and people told me this in their exact own words. They're like, of course Iraq did 9/11, or else why would we be attacking them then, commie? Right? Like, no, that's not it. They're taking advantage of your assumption that they wouldn't use you like this, but they would. Right? And in fact, I would argue, because I was a cab driver at the time, so I'd have like a captive audience to argue with people about this stuff. And the richer and the more well-educated they were, the more wrong they were about this. Regular Joes were like, I don't believe in this crap. But people who were like, I'm a dentist, they all were like, yay, we're going to go and get Saddam that did 9/11. And they couldn't back up their statements at all. I mean, I remember arguing with a guy, hey, man, you go check, you go Google it and take care and look. And I guarantee you will not find George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, or George Tenet saying that Saddam Hussein did 9/11. You will find Dick Cheney saying that. And you'll find neocons in the Weekly Standard and the National Review saying that, but you will not find any of the other principals claiming Saddam did the attack. Go look carefully and see. And he's like, no, I know you're wrong. I know that can't be right. And he's like a millionaire guy or like a very wealthy business owner guy.
You know what it's like?
I know that that's not right. I know otherwise he couldn't understand. This is how he rationalized. Why would we be attacking them then? And then think about all of the people who bought that. And then from their point of view, looking at the left half of America and the libertarians, most of us anyway, but nobody cares about us. But imagine all of them looking at the leftists and the liberals and saying, you commie pinko traitor rats, I can't believe that after September 11th, you don't want to do anything about it at all? You're just going to let these terrorists walk all over us? Right? Now, those people were saying, no, man, but Saddam didn't do it. But they couldn't hear that. They couldn't hear that. They believed that Saddam did it. And so they came to see everyone who opposed Iraq War II as just – they couldn't believe it. These are our countrymen, right? To paraphrase Samuel Adams, that like, what the hell are – all of you better move to California before the Civil War breaks out. Damn it. Like they couldn't believe it, but they were the ones who were completely lost. And then the torture scandal breaks out and Bush says, not only is it not torture, but you're damn right it's torture. We have to torture. Isn't that right? Yeah. American right. You support me and believe in this and you'll defend me, won't you? And they all did. He insisted and they did. And they weren't torturers before. They hadn't even thought of it, most of them. But Bush demanded that they endorse and rally around him and defend him on the torture charges. And so that really just alienated the hell out of not just, the party members and the leadership in D.C. and whatever, but the American people, where nieces and uncles at Thanksgiving are like stabbing each other with forks. And I hate you. And how dare you? Mm-hmm. And what do you know? And back and forth, families divided. Really? I mean, talk about opportunity costs. How about the American people? How about the American families that were torn apart? Not just America itself, but families torn apart by fighting over Iraq War II. That never had to happen at all. It's amazing, like the degree of impunity there. And it's all because of all the people on TV. They were all in on it. They all went along with it. And so there's no accountability for any of them. So we have the exact same Jake Tapper now as we had before. The exact same no one ever said, that's it. Everyone who fell for this is fired, and we're going to go find everybody in the alternative media who got it right, and they're all going to be hired to replace them. Nope, never happened. So here we are still. Yeah,
still listening to the same voices that sold us all the lies, and then you wonder why people point at them and say you're fake news, or there's this like kind of war on media, and it's because they've been exposed. People know what they are, and I mean. That wasn't even the first time they did that. I mean, you go back to, what was it, World War II, you had or was it World War One? I think it was World War One, where they were talking about babies on bayonets.
Yeah, World War One.
They had that, yeah. And then in 91, they were throwing babies out of the incubators, going into Iraq. And it's like, how many times can you lie us into the war? I think it was, wasn't it in, I can't think of the guy's name that wrote The Art of War. That
Sun Tzu.
Asian guy, Sun Tzu. Didn't he say, isn't there a quote of his where it's something like, you cannot have a war without being lied into it, or something along that line?
Probably. I don't know.
I think
It's been a long
there
time
was
since
a quote out there.
it's been since Saturday Detention that I read that book. I probably should look at it again.
I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but it was something like you can't have war without no war has ever existed without the government lying the citizens into it, or something along that lines.
You know what, man?
But,
I have a blog entry like that. They lied us into war, all of them. And it's all of them from 1812 all the way through, and maybe even including the American Revolution. I forgot if I included that or not. But and major lies to justify each and every war fought by the Americans all along.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing, you were talking about the fact that when you were driving a cab, you'd argue with like dentists and all these highly educated people, and the thing that struck me was it's funny that the longer a person spends in a government approved or subsidized education center, the more likely they are to believe the government.
I mean, it's all social psychology, right? It's all just, who do you identify with? Whose side are you on? And if you're on this side, this is what we believe this week, and whatever, So, like, for example, right wingers don't like the UN because they're baby blue flag and cooperation and helping people and stuff. And they get us into wars, right? Where we have all these complicated treaties and arrangements and enforcing international law where there's some border dispute between two countries we've never heard of. And now it has to be our business and intervene. But then George Bush Jr. comes to power. And now all of a sudden our problem with the UN is that they won't help us start a war. They're in our way and they're trying to slow us down, and they're a pain. And so now it's still the same baby blue flag that we hate, and it's still all the helping people and whatever that we resent because screw them. But now instead of we resent them for getting us into trouble, now we resent them for being in our way when we're trying to get ourselves into trouble. And they can just turn on a dime. They don't even notice. They don't even notice the contradiction that these are the same people with the same opinion who then got it twisted and then kept on going and had no idea what had just happened to them. And I saw that happen in real time.
Yeah.
And that was the whole narrative about in Iraq War II was, we're going to enforce these UN resolutions whether the UN wants us to or not, because that's how much we care about international law. And then you got Republicans going, yeah, like, are you kidding me? Come on, these guys. Anyway.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, hey, man,
not just Republicans, but right wingers coming out of the Clinton years. Going, three cheers for enforcing the UN's laws, whether they want us to or not. Huh?
They're all of a sudden our friends. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all just about whose side you're on, unfortunately. And, that's the lucky thing really about being a libertarian is, or even not even a libertarian, but just be a George Carlinian or whatever. You don't have to sign up with any of these people. You don't have to agree with this side or that. You don't have to choose. And look at what's going on now with all these liberals denouncing Trump for wanting to get out of Syria. Just because anything Trump wants to do, it's all just personality and not, well, actually. And think of how easy it is to say, well, screw him, but I sure agree with him on that. I mean, what does that hurt you? What does that cost you? To say, hell yeah, get out of Syria, and also I hate Trump still, or whatever. But nope, they can't do it. They have to say, if it's a thing that he's doing, then we must oppose it, no matter what it is. If he was setting their uncle free from prison, they'd oppose that too, or what?
Right. But what I think it is, and I think I hear this a lot, and they talk about the amount of Americans that identify as independents, and they may lean Republican or Democrat, but they identify as independents, and they try to make excuses. Oh, well, they don't want to appear like they're biased or on a team or this, that, and the other. And the more I think about it, the more I think it's more that these people that identify as independents identify as independent because they have principles they try to put ahead of the party. And the party they abandon principles for the party. You know what I'm saying? And so
I'm
They
more
may
cynical than
lean-
that. I mean, I think mostly independent means they got no real opinions or wishy-washy, kind of centrist, go along, get along, and you can't nail them down on anything because they don't have any principles and they can't explain nothing. So if they really knew, they would say, well, I would support the Constitution Party, except I hate them, or, well, I try to support the Greens because I'm pretty much, an environmentalist, socialist type, or I'm a libertarian, more, I wish they would do better, but I essentially agree with them on freeing the market. But I mean,
Yeah.
anyone who just goes, well, I'm an independent. I don't know what the hell that means. To me, it means centrist who's gonna, I don't even know what. Do they really watch the TV ads closely to see whose face they think is more symmetrical, or what is it that's their standard?
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, you could be right. Like you say, you are a little more cynical on that. But it just seems to me like, because I know what led me to libertarianism was I was always standing on principle. And I was always like, well, this is what I believe. I believe this as my principle. So I can't, support this politician or that politician or this. And it didn't matter to me if they claimed to be conservative or whatever. And I remember looking at George W. Bush, before, it was right around the time that Obama was elected. It was right before he was elected, I believe. And I remember looking at like what George W. Bush had been doing and what I had believed when he was actually going into Iraq, and then what I had found out since he had been in Iraq. And I was like, this guy is scum, like that's all I could think. And that's what really got me to look in other directions,
Yeah. That's interesting.
So there are people out there that do have principles that they would really like to believe that they're voting or standing on principle. And those
Right.
are the ones that when you point out, well, this, going like bombing for peace is like fucking for virginity, it's not going to work. And you start pointing these fallacies out and you can actually like change their minds.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I mean,
but there,
and of course that's really the thing, right? Is, there's this huge gap between the truth and the narrative as they push it, and a huge gap between the reality and what's morally right. So you constantly have everybody, you, me, and everybody else who's, interested in, these sorts of politics or really kind of any sort of alternative politics, I think. Almost all of us come from seeing one egregious thing that did not fit the narrative and could not be spun in a way satisfactory to us. And so now what? Right? So these guys are our security force, and what would we ever do without them? And all hail the heroes of law enforcement. And then there's the Waco massacre. And so how am I supposed to, and then, even right wingers are saying these are jackbooted thugs, man. This isn't a security force. This is a occupation army. What the hell is going on here, right? And then also, so that was, happened under the Democrats, but I'll make sure to be bipartisan here, that the war on drugs was severely escalated by not just the Ronald Reagan administration, but the states and the city governments under that same era, and with federal money and intervention and caught up in the whole movement to do it and what have you, at the same time that they were the largest supplier of powdered cocaine into this country from Nicaragua in support of their effort for the Contras, who were, right-wing death squads trying to overthrow an elected commie government.
right.
And this just absolutely was responsible for so many social problems in terms of, the crack epidemic, and then all the gang warfare that went with control, because it was still illegal. So it was still all a black market, but now it's a black market with a huge supply. And so had massive wars in major cities all across the country for control over that supply and the distribution of it and all the rest of it. That was the cops that did that. That was the CIA. Mm-hmm. And the DEA and the LAPD, for example, at various times tried to do something about it and were thwarted at every turn because the real Uncle Sam is in on this plot. And so, now try to go back again and forget you don't know that. You know what I mean? How are you supposed to believe in them after that? So for you, it's Iraq War II. I know that was a big deal with Dave. Dave was like, hey, Bush says we got to do Iraq War II. Then fine. I'm still mad about 9/11 and sounds right to me. And then very quickly, I think I'm telling that right. I hope I'm telling that right. I'm pretty sure that was what he said. And then very soon after that went, wait a minute. Or maybe it wasn't even that. Maybe it was, I know what it was. It was, no. It was, he didn't even support Iraq War II. He supported the war in Afghanistan. And then just a few months later in March of 2002, sorry, Dave, for screwing up the first part, but I got it right now. In March of 2002, he saw Bush at that press conference say, well, I'm really not that concerned about Osama bin Laden. As long as he's on the run and marginalized, I don't care about him. It's all about Saddam Hussein now. And you, lady, questioning me at this press conference, are a damn fool for thinking that the war on terrorism is about catching one man, you know, the leader of the group that did the attack. And Dave saw that because George Bush is just so lousy. George W. Bush, for the young kids who don't know, look up this clip. He is such a ham-handed, dim-witted, cruel, stupid, little incompetent, you know, whatever he is. Somebody else come up with one more adjective to finish that for me. And then so he just blows it. He just botches it, right? Like he has this narrative he's trying to sell, but he just can't figure out how to express it without saying, I have called off the mission to get the man most responsible for the attack on this country, and now I am baiting and switching your sorry ass to Saddam Hussein with the clean-shaven chin 1,000 miles west of our target. And they didn't have – no one else in that audience had the courage. In fact, the lady asking the question, I don't want to sell her short because maybe she was sharp as a tack. But it seemed to me like her thing was like, well, Mr. President, I'm kind of confused about something. Can you help me understand? In other words, like she wasn't being hypercritical, but she thought that she must be confused because it seemed like kind of weird that how come you always talk about Saddam but not Osama? But like, I mean, the last I heard, he's still out there, right? So what's the deal with that? We're talking about less than half a year after the 9/11 attack. And so it was when Dave saw that, he was like, wait a minute. And, you know, and then I guess Bush made a lefty out of him then, and then Ron Paul came and explained why, no, it's the libertarians who got it figured out kind of thing, and he went for that. But, you know, everybody has their story, but it usually is based on some government atrocity, you know. There was a guy named Donald Scott who was like a landowner in California, and the government just wanted his land. And so they set him up on some fake pot charge, or maybe he had one pot plant or something, and they killed him just to take his land, like something straight out of an episode of the A-Team or something. Like, are you kidding me? What is this? You know? And that was, you know, got to a lot of people before Waco even. That was like a little mini Waco. Like,
I never heard of that.
Yeah, there's a million of them. But so yeah, that's the deal. They say they're our security force, so they're having a harder and harder time living up to that reputation. It seems like more and more there's no confidence in the services they claim that they're providing. You know, one of the headlines right now today is that this actress from the TV show ER named Vanessa Marquez was shot and killed by the police in South Pasadena. That's in Northeast LA. And she was having some kind of panic attack. I mean, you know what? People have anxiety attacks sometimes, you know, I don't know. So her landlord called the police, or maybe she tried to call an ambulance, but the cops showed up and had some kind of, you know, standoff where she refused to talk to them, which should have been her right or whatever. And eventually they say she grabbed a pellet gun that looked like a gun, so they had to wax her. Jeez. And it just sounds like, you know, I don't know, man. These are the same people over and over again that all they talk about is how bad we need them. But it seems like pretty obvious from this side that they are the most violent and destructive force in society by far, rather than being our security force really at all.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
we see it all the time.
You hear all the time how they view citizens as the criminal, or you're automatically guilty in their eyes, and they act as an occupying force. They're not, you know, out there preserving life, liberty, and property. They are following edicts of the government. They don't
They don't care about your individual rights or if you are a free citizen or this, that, or the other. They believe that the government owns you and it is their job to keep you in line. And, you know, they have to herd you to wherever you're supposed to be.
Yep. And, you know, not to blame everything on Israel, but the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, which actually I think they changed the affairs to something else. But anyway, still, JINSA, they've worked for years very successfully on getting American police to go to Israel to train with the cops whose job it is to oppress the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. They're not training them on this is how we deal with Israeli Jews in Tel Aviv. They're training them on how do they deal with the Palestinians in their, you know, occupied, stateless helotry, you know, their permanent purgatory occupation, existence in the West Bank there. And then the cops come home and use this on Americans. And on top of that, of course, you have combat veterans coming home from the wars, many of whom are perfectly responsible, but many of whom are in a situation where, look, their job is essentially a lot like their job in Iraq, prowling around looking for a fight. And yet these are supposed to be very different rules of engagement. This is supposed to be an entirely different job. I mean, they try to dress up the war there like it was some kind of police. We are the security force for these people. We're going to love them to death till they love us back and this kind of thing. And so that makes it even worse in a way that like that level of hyper violence under the guise of being a security force. I mean, you know, young officer back from Iraq War II could be a really excited and dangerous kind of a force. I know one in Austin where a cop who was a Iraq War II veteran was chasing, I think, a burglar or somebody who was accused of shoplifting or something, and chased him through the grocery store parking lot, just firing at him. Pow, 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 pow. And one of the rounds had gone through the back of a lady's minivan, through the back seat, and through the baby car seat into the front seat. So like, if the baby had been in the seat, they had just gotten there instead of parked 5 minutes ago, the baby would have been dead. And this guy's just firing blind in the parking lot. And then he said, I was back in Iraq. Sorry. I mean, you know what? I resign. My bad kind of thing, you know, took responsibility and blamed Iraq, but not in a way to excuse himself, but to explain that, you know, what happened was, man, I kind of was back there again and forgot I was in Austin, Texas, where I'm supposed to be your security guard much more than your infantry man, you know?
Right.
So it's all, and you know what? It won't be very long at all before all these sheriff's departments are flying Reaper drones over our towns too. Because what are you going to do with them all? If not give them to the cops, they're going to give them to the cops, you know?
Right. Yeah. I had posted the other day on Facebook that, you know, maybe we could actually promote the rights of citizens, and the United States government can start giving all these weapons they have no use for to impoverish families in America instead of terrorist organizations around the world.
Yeah, man.
Maybe that would do some good. That's one welfare system I could actually get behind.
Yeah, I mean, think of all the interesting and creative and important goods that could be created with all those materials if they weren't being sunk into all of this instead, you know?
Yeah.
All those resources. Yeah. And for that matter, think of all the brilliant minds that are slaving away at the Pentagon, you know, either doing nothing or coming up with ingenious new ways to deliver firepower to somebody, but who otherwise could be devising improvements in goods and services for regular people, distribution networks for food and important needs for poor people around the world, and God knows what, you know?
Right. Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
Opportunity costs, indeed, you know?
We're up over 2 hours now.
So oh, man, let's go.
We're gonna cut this.
We'll go.
Yeah, we're going to cut this here. So.
Yeah, you know what? You should go through and cut out a lot of what I said, because what the hell? I would.
I don't know if I'm going to do that or not. I'm going to see. I'm going to listen to it here in a little bit, and you can do all the editing and stuff.
I don't
like
care
that.
what you cut if you do, so don't worry about me.
Okay, buddy. Well, I'm gonna let you go now. I'll record the closeout here later. Here
All
in,
right, well, right on. Thanks
here in
again
a-
for
here in
having me,
a-
man.
Yeah, no, thanks for being on. That was Stranger Encounters with Scott Horton. Check out all his work at the libertarianinstitute.org and antiwar.com. I'm Tommy Salmons. Late.